Ford Motor Company didn't hold a press conference. There were no cameras, no handshakes, and no flashy headlines announcing a major milestone. But behind closed doors, the legacy American automaker signed one of its most consequential deals in decades. Only this time, it wasn't with Washington or Detroit. It was with Canada. The agreement redirected billions of dollars, investment capital, equipment, and future production lines northward. Before the public even caught wind of what was happening, internal logistics were already shifting. Equipment was being transported, planning documents were sealed, and critical workforce decisions had already been made. In a strategic move cloaked in silence, Ford effectively initiated a quiet exodus from American soil. But this wasn't just a simple business expansion, it was something more calculated, more permanent. This wasn't about growing Ford's footprint globally, it was about relocating its future. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now on to the video. The move sent shockwaves through those who eventually discovered it. For decades, Ford was synonymous with American industry. Its name was carved into the identity of cities like Dearborn and Detroit, written into the DNA of the American labor movement, and proudly attached to generations of blue-collar workers who had dedicated their lives to the brand. Yet, Ford didn't inform them. No town halls, no internal memos, no advance notice to the workers whose livelihoods depended on those assembly lines. When the news finally did break, it didn't come from Ford's PR department. It came from a trickle of media reports and leaked government documents filed in Ontario and Quebec. By the time headlines surfaced, it was already too late. Ford had made up its mind. The machinery of change was in motion, both literally and figuratively. Factories in the United States weren't being upgraded. They were being bypassed. The EV and battery plants, critical to the next phase of Ford's evolution, were not going to Michigan, Ohio, or any part of the American Rust Belt. They were going straight to Canada. The decision wasn't just symbolic, it was systemic. It signaled a massive reorientation of Ford's supply chain, workforce development, and political alignment. Billions of dollars in capital expenditures were now headed to Canadian provinces that had spent the last decade methodically building a clean energy, EV-ready industrial ecosystem. And while some media outlets tried to explain the move as simply a business decision, insiders saw the truth clearly. This was a pivot away from the United States, not just in geography, but in ideology. Ford was betting on stability, subsidies, and a system that worked. And in their view, that no longer described America. The internal logic made sense, on paper. Labor costs in the U.S. were rising. Regulatory uncertainty had become the norm. EV incentives were inconsistent and politically volatile. And the infrastructure, both physical and legislative, was often tangled in red tape. Meanwhile, Canada was offering something very different. Ontario had streamlined its permitting system. Quebec had access to lithium and a clean grid. Both provinces had aligned their trade strategies with global sustainability goals and were actively courting multinationals with strategic investment packages. Ford didn't need to wait years for permits. They didn't need to fight political culture wars over EV policy. In Canada, the path forward was clear and paved with incentives. Still, for the average American worker, none of that mattered. What they saw was simple. A company they had helped build was quietly packing up its future and heading north, leaving behind empty plants, broken promises, and a trail of confusion. More importantly, this wasn't just about Ford. It was a warning shot across the entire American industrial landscape. If Ford could shift its most strategic assets abroad without notice, what would stop other companies from following suit? The answer, as the weeks that followed would reveal, was nothing. And as the first whispers of Ford's move began to echo through political corridors, it was only a matter of time before those whispers turned into a roar, one that would shake Washington, ignite union unrest, and unravel decades of North American manufacturing cooperation. But that's just the beginning. For more than a century, Ford Motor Company stood as an emblem of American innovation and grit. It was born in Detroit, raised in the assembly lines of Michigan, and elevated by the hardworking men and women of the Midwest. To many, Ford wasn't just a company, it was a part of the American soul. But in a single stroke, that legacy was left behind. The decision to move Ford's next-generation electric vehicle, EV, and battery manufacturing operations to Canada wasn't just logistical, it was personal. For communities like Dearborn, Flat Rock, and Flint, this wasn't merely a shift in operations. It was a deep betrayal. These towns had weathered decades of plant closures and economic downturns with the hope that one day reinvestment would come. They accepted the layoffs, adapted to automation, and endured recession after recession, all in the name of loyalty. Workers made concessions, shorter breaks, wage freezes, reduced pension plans. Union leaders negotiated in good faith, hoping that keeping the lights on meant keeping the dream alive. They held on because Ford was their company, and now Ford had made its biggest investment in decades, and it wasn't in America. There were no warning signs. Local leaders didn't get advance notice. Union halls found out the same way the public did, through news alerts and leaked documents. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was a gut punch. Across factory floors, the mood turned from anxious to angry. "So we meant nothing?" became a common refrain. For workers who had once worn the Ford logo with pride, the shift northward felt like an identity crisis. This wasn't just economic realignment, it was emotional abandonment. Even Ford's silence spoke volumes. There were no outreach efforts, no effort to soothe tensions or explain the rationale. Internally, executives maintained that the Canadian investment was necessary to stay globally competitive, but externally, their absence was deafening. For many, it confirmed what they feared most. Ford had made its choice, and that choice didn't include them. Beyond emotional fallout, the implications for American industry were massive. Ford's departure signaled to other automakers and heavy manufacturers that the U.S. was no longer the assumed destination for expansion. If Ford, so tightly woven into the fabric of American history, could make this move, why wouldn't others follow? The move also redefined loyalty in the corporate world. It revealed a harsh new truth. Loyalty was now a one-way street. Workers were expected to be flexible, adaptable, and patriotic, while corporations were free to pivot, realign, and relocate without consequence. Communities that had built themselves around Ford facilities were left scrambling. Local economies that relied on factory jobs were suddenly unstable. Schools funded by property taxes from auto plants faced budget shortfalls. Small businesses that served workers saw foot traffic dry up. And mayors who had once touted their cities as proud Ford towns now had to answer an impossible question from their constituents. What now? What stung the most, though, was the symbolism. Ford wasn't just any company. It was America's car company. It had survived wars, recessions, and revolutions in technology. And now, in the pivotal shift toward electrification, the very future of transportation, it had chosen to make its stand elsewhere. The message to Michigan was unmistakable. You are no longer essential. And as the dust settled from Ford's quiet departure, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a story about business strategy. It was a referendum on American relevance. And the judgment was harsh. But the betrayal at home was only half the story. Because while Ford was stepping back, another nation was stepping in, with a strategy that had been in motion for years. If Ford's sudden pivot stunned the U.S., it didn't surprise Canada. That's because this wasn't a lucky break for Ottawa. It was the result of a decade-long master plan designed to rewire the industrial core of the country, quietly and effectively. Long before headlines began mentioning Ford's relocation, Canadian policymakers were laying the groundwork. While Washington wavered between tax credits and political infighting, Ottawa was building something far more powerful: certainty. It started with targeted incentives. Ontario and Quebec launched aggressive subsidies for clean energy projects, EV production, and battery development. But this wasn't just about money, it was about building a complete ecosystem. The Canadian government streamlined environmental regulations, not by weakening them, but by speeding them up. Permits that took years in the US could be processed in months. Red tape was cut. Bureaucracy was simplified. Investment flowed. Crucially, Canada made itself a safe bet. The political environment was stable. The messaging was clear. The support was bipartisan. For companies like Ford, which operate on long-term timelines, this clarity mattered more than anything else. At the heart of the strategy was a simple question: how can we make Canada the easiest place to build the future? The answer came in three parts. First, workforce development. Canadian provinces began investing heavily in trade schools, technical institutes, and university programs tailored for EV manufacturing. Partnerships between public colleges and private factories became the norm. Students weren't just learning, they were training for specific roles already mapped out by manufacturers. Second, supply chain sovereignty. Canada secured access to key resources like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth metals essential for battery production. Unlike the US, which remained dependent on overseas imports, Canada struck domestic deals and international partnerships to guarantee access. Third, political insulation. Companies were promised minimal interference from Ottawa in exchange for transparency and investment. That meant no surprise taxes, no politicized investigations, and no regulatory whiplash. In return, firms like Ford were expected to hit job creation and sustainability targets, a deal both sides were happy to make. The result? A quiet revolution. Ontario and Quebec transformed into North America's green manufacturing corridors. EV startups launched. Battery plants broke ground. Legacy automakers began redirecting R&D dollars to Canadian research hubs. And the government didn't just cheer from the sidelines, it built the playing field. By the time Ford was evaluating its options, the decision was practically made for them. Canada didn't just look like a better option, it was the better system. Ford didn't have to worry about whether the next U.S. election would shift EV policy. It didn't have to fight for clean energy subsidies or negotiate new labor rules every quarter. In Canada, the pieces were already in place. Meanwhile, the U.S. was still stuck in neutral. Political battles over climate policy, union negotiations, and infrastructure funding dragged on. Permits stalled. Tax incentives came with caveats and expiration dates. For every policy breakthrough, there were 5 steps backward. So when Ford finally signed its deal with Ontario and Quebec, it wasn't a gamble. It was a calculated move into an ecosystem that had been quietly outpacing the U.S. for years. And as the news began to trickle out, America's political leaders braced for impact. But no one responded louder or faster than Donald J. Trump. It didn't take long for the news to reach Trump. While speaking at a rally in Pennsylvania, the former president was tipped off mid-speech about Ford's Canada deal. What happened next was no accident. Trump looked into the camera, paused, and made a calculated, targeted threat. If Ford thinks it can build cars in Canada and ship them back here, they're about to learn what a 200% tariff feels like. The crowd roared. Cable news hosts froze. Analysts scrambled to interpret what had just happened. But one thing was clear. The gloves were off. Trump's statement wasn't just political theater. It was a direct shot at Ford and a message to every corporation considering offshoring its production. We see you, and we will retaliate. Within hours, the Trump campaign doubled down. Press releases called Ford's move a betrayal of American workers. Senior advisors floated ideas for emergency tariffs. Trade hawks labeled the company a threat to national security. The rhetoric was brutal and personal. For Trump, this wasn't just about economic policy. It was about narrative. Ford's move was the perfect storm. A beloved American brand, a cross-border betrayal, and a manufacturing base that had been promised protection. It was everything his 2016 campaign stood against, and everything his 2024 campaign would be built on. Inside Ford's headquarters, the mood was panic. According to insider leaks, the boardroom went into full lockdown mode. The company had expected some pushback, but not like this, not this fast, not this surgical. Ford's legal and PR teams scrambled. Emergency calls were made to trade lawyers, government liaisons, and international advisors. Contingency plans were drafted. Would the vehicles still be allowed into the U.S.? What would a 200% tariff do to pricing? How would investors respond? Financial news networks fanned the flames. Pundits argued over whether Trump could legally enforce such tariffs without congressional approval. Union leaders held urgent calls with White House officials. Congressional representatives from Michigan and Ohio demanded clarity. Everyone had the same question: what happens next? The truth was, nobody knew. Trump's statement had upended the game. It had transformed Ford's strategic pivot into a full-blown trade crisis, and it had done so with a single sentence. For Trump, the political calculus was obvious. He had been gifted a high-profile example of corporate disloyalty, and he intended to use it. Ford's move became a rallying cry for economic nationalism. It wasn't just about Ford. It was about defending American identity. The fallout was immediate. Stocks dipped. Trade groups issued cautious statements. Ford's competitors quietly delayed their own international deals, waiting to see how the administration would react. And while the media focused on Trump's remarks, something even more profound was unfolding behind the scenes. Washington was waking up to the fact that it had no playbook for this moment. The global rules were changing, and America had just been caught flat-footed. But the biggest consequences weren't unfolding in boardrooms or TV studios. They were happening in the towns Ford had left behind, and the backlash brewing there would make Trump's tariffs look like the opening act. In Michigan, the mood wasn't political, it was personal. Ford's announcement didn't just signal a shift in industrial strategy, it shattered decades of trust between an iconic company and the people who built it. In union halls from Wayne County to Macomb, the reaction was raw. "So we meant nothing?" one auto worker asked during an emergency meeting. It wasn't rhetorical. That question echoed through communities where Ford had once been more than an employer. It had been family. For generations, Michigan had given Ford everything. Its best workers, its best engineers. Entire cities like Dearborn and Flat Rock were defined by Ford's presence. Schools bore the Ford name. Scholarships, parades, Little League sponsorships, these were more than corporate gestures. They were proof of a relationship built over time. But relationships require reciprocity. And when Ford signed its billion-dollar deal with Ontario and Quebec without so much as a press release for its American hometowns, the betrayal hit harder than any layoff ever had. This wasn't a sudden shift. Michigan had endured layoffs and automation waves before. It had adjusted, fought back, and even rebranded parts of its identity around EV production. It wasn't resistance to change that hurt. It was the complete lack of inclusion. Ford had previously made commitments, publicly and privately, about investing in U.S.-based EV infrastructure. Michigan was banking on it. State development officials had created incentive packages. Local unions had flexed wages to remain competitive, and job retraining programs were already in place. They had done the work, and they were ignored. Mayors across Michigan issued public statements demanding answers. Congressional representatives called for hearings. One Flint City Council member referred to the deal as a slap in the face, not just to the workers, but to the American idea of loyalty. And yet, Ford remained largely silent. The anger wasn't limited to workers. Local suppliers, companies that provided parts, logistics, and services to Ford facilities, were now facing existential questions. Would they follow Ford across the border? Could they survive the drop in volume if they didn't? The uncertainty rippled across industries, threatening a wider economic downturn. Meanwhile, younger workers, many of whom had joined Ford with the promise of a high-tech EV-forward future, felt blindsided. They had embraced the transition from gas to electric. They had enrolled in certification programs and bought into the narrative that they were the future of American automotive innovation. But the future, it seemed, had no room for them. Ford's boardroom, flush with investor praise and rising stock prices, remained insulated from the emotional and economic carnage on the ground. From their perspective, the Canadian deal was a win. From Michigan's perspective, it was abandonment. Worse, it set a precedent. If Ford could walk away, what would stop GM, Stellantis, or even Tesla from doing the same? What good were subsidies, retraining, or political support if companies could reroute strategy overnight? The emotional fracture was now a political one. Both Republicans and Democrats in the state began introducing retaliatory bills and subsidy clawbacks aimed squarely at Ford. Union leaders who had supported recent bipartisan infrastructure deals began pulling endorsements. The trust between government, labor, and industry, already fragile, was unraveling fast. And in the background, the people of Michigan were left to process the final, brutal realization. The company they had built no longer saw them as part of its future. While the drama surrounding Ford's Canadian relocation played out in boardrooms and newsrooms, the most immediate consequences were felt on the ground, at Ford dealerships across the United States. In places like Texas, Ohio, Florida, and Indiana, long-standing dealerships began to experience something they had never seen before: empty lots. Gone were the rows of F-Series trucks. Gone were the showroom Explorers, Broncos, and Mustangs. Allocation numbers, which dealerships relied on for monthly revenue forecasts, didn't just dip, they plummeted. Some dealers reported receiving less than 10% of their usual stock. Others were told entire vehicle lines would be unavailable for the foreseeable future. And while customers could see the missing inventory with their own eyes, they couldn't see the reason. To them, the dealers were at fault. The frustration, once aimed at factory supply chains, was now being redirected at the faces closest to the problem: dealership staff. "We have nothing to sell," one dealership owner in Michigan said. "And worse, we can't even explain why." Customers expected to negotiate financing terms, compare models, or drive off the lot with a vehicle the same day. Now they were being told to wait months, or to look elsewhere. Many didn't wait. With other brands like Toyota and Hyundai maintaining stronger inventory pipelines, consumers began walking away from Ford entirely. Some buyers abandoned the American brand they had supported for decades, turning to whichever company could meet their needs immediately. The financial pressure on dealerships skyrocketed. Floor plan financing, loans dealers used to keep inventory on hand, still had to be paid. Overhead costs remained. Staff salaries, utilities, insurance, all continued to drain accounts. But without product, there was no revenue. Desperation set in. Some dealership owners took out personal loans to make payroll. Others began quietly listing their businesses for sale. A few filed for bankruptcy. Ford Motor Credit didn't help the situation. As the company pivoted to Canada, its financing arm tightened credit conditions. Loyalty discounts and promotional rates vanished. The once dependable rhythm of the American car dealership was disintegrating. The situation was unprecedented, and Ford's leadership appeared unconcerned. Dealers felt abandoned, just like the factory workers before them. They had invested in massive showrooms, training programs, marketing, and service centers based on the belief that Ford's U.S. pipeline would remain stable. That belief was now in ruins. Behind closed doors, some dealership coalitions even considered legal action. If Ford was knowingly redirecting inventory outside the U.S. while encouraging dealers to maintain costly infrastructure, was that not a form of misrepresentation? For many, the issue wasn't just economic. It was cultural. Ford dealerships were staples of American towns. They sponsored local high school sports. They served generations of drivers. They were trusted institutions. Now, they were crumbling, through no fault of their own. Ford's Canadian strategy might have made sense to investors, but to American dealerships, it was a business decision that felt like sabotage. And as showrooms emptied and out-of-stock signs went up across the country, another kind of sign started appearing, handwritten ones taped to service bay windows and office doors. They read, "Closed, no inventory, no choice." The United Auto Workers were the first to erupt, but they wouldn't be the last. Ford's decision to shift its EV and battery operations to Canada triggered more than media outrage or economic forecasting. It triggered something far more dangerous: a national labor uprising. It began in Wayne County with spontaneous walkouts. Factory workers who felt blindsided by the deal simply downed their tools and left the building. Union leaders attempted to negotiate with Ford's U.S. leadership, but meetings were met with vague reassurances and bureaucratic delays. Then the walkout spread. In Illinois, grain terminal workers joined in solidarity, citing a growing pattern of corporate offshoring. In Georgia, poultry processing plants faced mass absences as workers refused to report for overtime shifts. The frustration wasn't just with Ford anymore. It was with a system that seemed to reward companies for abandoning the very people who made their success possible. Social media amplified the message. Hashtags like #workers, left behind and had not, next began trending. TikTok videos of walkouts went viral. Reddit threads coordinated action. For once, the labor movement didn't need formal coordination. It had momentum. The Biden administration scrambled. Department of Labor officials were dispatched to calm tensions. Emergency calls were held with governors. But the mood among workers was clear. They didn't want platitudes. They wanted protection. Meanwhile, political fractures emerged. Some Republicans backed Ford's right to globalize operations. Others, particularly from the Rust Belt, began sounding the alarm on what they called economic treason. Democrats, fearing the loss of union support, pushed for retaliatory legislation, but even that was viewed with skepticism. What made this uprising unique was its decentralization. There was no single leader, no formal agenda, just a shared sentiment that American labor was being systematically ignored and that loyalty to corporations was now a liability. Even non-union workers joined the chorus. Tech workers in San Jose began circulating open letters demanding transparency on their company's offshoring plans. Trucking dispatchers in Nevada staged a symbolic one-day strike. It was no longer about Ford, it was about fairness. As tensions rose, companies took notice. HR departments across industries began sending preemptive emails reassuring workers of their job security. But it wasn't enough. The Ford fallout had cracked something wide open. And as voices grew louder and protests became more organized, one thing became clear. This was no longer just a labor issue. It was a reckoning. For once, Congress was united. But it was already too late. As headlines about Ford's cross-border deal dominated news cycles and walkouts surged across multiple states, Washington, D.C. launched into full-blown damage control. Bipartisan fury erupted across the House and Senate, and for the first time in years, Democrats and Republicans found themselves pointing their frustration in the same direction, at Ford. The anger wasn't just performative. Lawmakers felt blindsided, humiliated, and politically exposed. Ford had accepted billions in U.S. subsidies and tax incentives over the past decade, money that was supposed to ensure jobs stayed on American soil. Instead, those funds now looked like fuel for an exodus. Senator Josh Hawley called it a textbook case of corporate betrayal funded by the American taxpayer. His proposal? Immediate legislation to claw back any subsidies granted to companies that relocate production overseas. Sherrod Brown, a Democrat from Ohio, echoed the sentiment. If you take our money, you build in America, period. The rhetoric grew hotter by the hour. A flurry of bills flooded the legislative docket. One proposal would retroactively revoke EV-related tax breaks from automakers building battery components outside the United States. Another aimed to block any future federal fleet purchases from companies not maintaining at least 80% of their production within U.S. borders. But perhaps the most aggressive bill came from a bipartisan duo, the Strategic Industrial Loyalty Act. If passed, it would formally classify any company that moved operations abroad while receiving active government incentives as a strategic defector. The consequences: immediate suspension of grants, tax breaks, and potentially civil litigation. Inside Ford's D.C. offices, lobbyists worked overtime. Quiet meetings were held with committee chairs. Industry trade groups launched a charm offensive. The message was simple. We need global flexibility to remain competitive. Punish us now, and you'll stifle innovation tomorrow. But few in Congress were listening. The political optics were disastrous. At a time when voters were demanding economic patriotism, Ford had become the poster child for everything wrong with corporate globalization. Even moderate voices in Congress, typically aligned with business interests, began backing retaliatory measures. The risk of appearing soft on outsourcing was simply too great. But the political theater masked a deeper failure, one that cut across party lines. For years, the U.S. had encouraged electrification without enforcement. It had handed out subsidies with no meaningful strings attached. And now, as factories disappeared and public anger boiled over, Congress was trying to close a barn door long after the horse had bolted. The damage was done. Ford wasn't reversing course. The Canadian deal was locked in. Production lines were being built. Battery materials were already being sourced. The capital had moved. The real estate had been secured, and no amount of backtracking in Washington could undo what had already been set in motion. In the end, the legislative retaliation might hurt Ford, but it wouldn't stop the trend. If anything, the chaos revealed a chilling truth. America had no coherent industrial policy, just a patchwork of subsidies, a divided legislature, and a bad habit of reacting when it's already too late. And while U.S. politicians scrambled to catch up, Canada was already making its next move. Ford's move to Canada wasn't just a corporate decision, it was a turning point. It exposed a broken system in Washington, ignited a nationwide labor revolt, and shattered the illusion that America still held the reins of industrial power. And most of all, it revealed a harsh truth. The global auto industry is moving forward, with or without the United States. Canada didn't steal the future. It simply built one while America argued over the past. Ford, once the pride of Detroit, is now something else entirely. A data-driven logistics empire chasing profit in a borderless world. The factories, the workers, the communities left behind, they're not just casualties of change. They're reminders of what happens when a nation forgets to plan for the future. So now, it's your turn. Was this a brilliant strategy by Ford, or the ultimate betrayal of American labor? Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.